On the morning of the 20th of July, as the German army surveyed the scene of their victory at Fromelles, soldiers of the Australian 1st Division arrived to replace the British on the front line south of the village of Pozières.
What crust do you belong to?
Positioned atop a ridge about 64 kilometres south of Fromelles, Pozières was more or less in the middle of the British sector of the Somme battlefield. Less than a week earlier, the southern section of the German second line near Pozières had been taken during the Battle of Bazentin Ridge. British command now saw the opportunity to complete the capture of this line in their sector by advancing northeast through Pozières and beyond. The British Fourth Army had attempted to take Pozières 3 weeks earlier, on the first day of the Somme offensive. They tried again on the 13th and 17th of July, still with no success and suffering heavy casualties. The village was subjected to heavy bombardment during this period, destroying many of the buildings and turning the surrounding country into a wasteland, particularly around the German trench lines. British troops had been unable to advance beyond Pozières Trench, south of the village, twice being pushed back. Their efforts to advance to the east of the village, up through what was known as the old German trench lines, also failed. The challenge now fell to the Australian 1st Division, which, like the 5th Division at Fromelles, was facing its first major battle on the Western Front. Arriving at the British front line, a trench system that in places was no more than a series of ditches, 1st Division soldiers spent 48 hours preparing for their attack under German artillery and gas bombardment. The Battle of Fromelles had rendered the Australian 5th Division unfit for fighting for many months to come. At Pozières, the 1st Division would initially succeed in occupying the village, only to become the subject of a devastating artillery bombardment, often said to be the heaviest experienced by Australians during the First World War. When the 1st Division was relieved by the 2nd, it had suffered more than 5,200 casualties.
Come on, men! Over the banks!
The Australian 1st Division began their attack at midnight on the 23rd of July, following a plan that required the 1st and 3rd Brigades to attack Pozières from the south and advancing in 3 stages. They would be supported to the northwest of the Albert-Bapaume Road by the British 48th Division, which would attack the German trenches to the west of the village. During the evening and night of July the 22nd, the eve of the attack, British and German artillery engaged in a fierce duel, a display of firepower that lit up the sky for miles around. The Australian 2nd Division, newly arrived at Albert 3 miles away, watched the bombardment from nearby high ground.
Oh, Jesus.
At 12:30 a.m., the Allied artillery lifted its fire, striking targets behind the German front line, and the first 2 waves of the 1st and 3rd Brigades began their assault, rapidly capturing the Pozières trench system south of the village. 45 minutes later, the Australians took their second objective, south of the Albert-Bapaume Road. However, to the east, the 3rd Brigade's advance faltered as the 9th and 10th Battalions met stiff resistance near the old German lines on their right. By 4 a.m., the Australian front line stretched diagonally across the south of the village, with the 1st Battalion at the western end edging toward the Albert-Bapaume Road, and the 9th and 10th Battalions experiencing intense resistance. By 7 a.m., shortly after sunrise, scouts had reported to 3rd Brigade commanders that German infantry was massing for a counterattack in the north of the village. Allied artillery bombarded the area, inflicting heavy casualties on the Germans and dispersing the attack. As the barrage lifted, German infantry was seen withdrawing, and the 2nd Battalion on the west flank crossed the Albert-Bapaume Road and pushed north through the ruins of the village. Meanwhile, toward the old German lines, the Australian assault remained stalled in the face of continuing heavy resistance. Brigadier General Sinclair McLagan ordered the battalions on the far right to renew the attack on the first line, but sustained German fire from the vicinity of the heavily fortified Pozières windmill continued to hinder this effort. The 10th Battalion's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Stanley Price Weir, described the fortification there as a cement keep which has the appearance of a cottage and will be very difficult to take without assistance from heavy guns which had not up to the present touched it. Several problems faced the 9th and 10th Battalions in their assault of the old German lines. The area had been so pummeled by artillery fire that orientation was difficult, and the two parallel German trench lines were not easily visible. Beneath the trenches were deep dugouts, impervious to the Allied bombardment, and occupied by German troops ready to emerge and engage the Australians. The Germans were also supported by concealed machine guns and by fire from the fortifications around the Pozières windmill. This well-defended position also meant that German fire could continue targeting Australian soldiers attempting to secure the eastern side of Pozières. The drawn-out struggle for the old German lines continued for days. By 10 a.m., further west of the old German lines, Australian observers watched German troops withdrawing toward the cemetery at the northern edge of the village. The 1st Brigade pursued them, capturing more and more of Pozières, engaging in vicious close-quarters fighting and taking prisoners as they advanced through the ruined buildings. By mid-afternoon, the Allied artillery had lifted its fire still further behind the German front lines as Australian troops secured the village. By 9 p.m. that evening, when 2nd Brigade's 8th Battalion arrived to reinforce them, 1st Brigade occupied a line about midway through the northern part of Pozières. As night fell on the 23rd of July, Australian soldiers digging in throughout the village were aware of their significant success. Despite the difficulty in securing the old German lines to the east, they'd succeeded in taking their objectives and now occupied an important German position in this sector of the Somme Valley. Orders for the 24th of July were for the Australians to press their advantage by advancing further north beyond the village towards Mouquet Farm and east against the old German lines. But this proved an impossible task. The Germans occupied a formidable position at Mouquet Farm, and the Australians had trouble repositioning their troops for this new assault in a ruined landscape now devoid of landmarks and under heavy German artillery bombardment. The German High Command ordered a strong response to the loss of Pozières, the only significant gain by Allied forces on this part of the front. At one point, 5th Battalion soldiers seized a section of the old German lines, but were driven back by the newly arrived 18th German Reserve Division, brought in to reinforce the main counterattack against the Australians. As the Australians consolidated their gains, the Germans opened a devastating artillery bombardment on Pozières. Australia's official correspondent to the Australian Imperial Force and later official historian of the war, Charles Bean, later wrote, "The German bombardment was, at first, methodical rather than intense. One battery, for example, firing directly along a deep trench just dug by the Australians on the southern side of the Albert-Bapaume road, pounded it systematically with about 4 shells a minute, breaking its sides and burying men whose comrades constantly dug them out, alive and dead. By evening, parts of that trench could not even be found by the relieving companies. The southwest entrance to the village was most heavily and continuously pounded, and the main approach route there was so lined with dead that it came to be called Dead Man's Road." Over the next 2 days, German and Allied artillery bombarded what remained of the shattered village of Pozières until this part of the front resembled a lunar landscape. The ferocious barrage was visible for miles, throwing up dust, smoke, and debris. Some Australians were outside the line of German fire. Others sheltered in the deep dugouts vacated by the German soldiers, while others still had to endure the terrible shell fire in the shelter of shell holes or broken trenches. The severity of the bombardment indicated the likelihood of a strong German counterattack, which the Australians expected would come on the evening of the 25th of July. But the fighting in the old German lines that morning between the Australian 5th Battalion and the German 18th Reserve Division, the exhausting artillery duel, and the enormous strain of the past 3 days compelled the Germans to abandon the attack.
Poor fella's totally rattled.
Emerging from the rubble of Pozières on the morning of the 27th to be relieved by the Australian 2nd Division, the survivors of the Australian 1st Division were described as being so dazed they appeared to be walking in a dream. They'd suffered more than 5,200 casualties in their first tour of Pozières.